want to welcome everyone to the INCOMPAS all virtual Connect In conference, the first that we've ever done. And we're very pleased and very happy and thankful to welcome Eric Schmidt as a keynote for our conference. Eric is an accomplished technologist, entrepreneur, philanthropist. He joined Google in 2001 and helped grow the company from a Silicon Valley startup to a global leader in technology alongside founders Sergey Brin and Larry Page. Eric served as Google CEO and chairman from 2001 to 2011, as well as executive chairman and technical advisor. Under his leadership, Google dramatically scaled its infrastructure, diversified its product offerings, and maintained a strong culture of innovation and ideas. In 2017, he founded Schmidt Futures, a philanthropic initiative designed to help exceptional people do more for others by applying science and technology thoughtfully and working together across all fields. Eric, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Chip. And when you told me about this conference, I said yes enthusiastically, because I like what you're trying to do. You and I have worked together for years, and there's no more important time now, I think, than us working on getting the world better connected. I mean, how fundamental is this, right?
You know, it's hard to believe that a little over 20 years ago, a company called Google started, and you're almost at your 20th anniversary from joining, and how the world has changed and the role Google played in it. It was truly transformational. And today, I feel like our discussion, we have an opportunity to talk about what I hope will be transformational in the future to come. But first, I'd like to start with a question for the audience. Talk about the Defense Innovation Board. Who serves on it, what it is, your role on it, why is it important?
Well, it's interesting, your questions are timely, because this week I stepped down after my 4-year term ended as chairman of the Defense Innovation Board. And the board was set up by the Secretary of Defense at the time, Ash Carter, but supported by the subsequent 3 Secretaries of Defense, I might add, in order to try to figure out how to apply innovation broadly, but in particular Silicon Valley innovation, to the DoD. We worked very hard on things like the Joint Center for AI, known as the JAIC, ethics in military conflict, and so forth. We were involved with things like the Maven project. We've done quite a bit of work on how to do software. And I think most important for you and your audience, we spent a fair amount of time looking at the question of dynamic sharing of spectrum. And the military is an amazing place. I'm a huge fan of our military, and I say that without any reservations. I think they're sincere people trying to serve us and keep our country safe. Their systems are terrible, and we need to upgrade them. We owe it to them to make their systems more effective.
One of the things that you looked at on the Defense Innovation Board is 5G.
Right.
Why is it important? Why is it important to the national security and international competitiveness? And what does it mean going forward if we were to lose the race to 5G as it relates to companies or countries, like China?
Well, it turns out one of the things that I learned in my 4 years at the DIB, which again has ended as of this week, was how much China is no longer a developing country, but is really a peer competitor. And the military doctrine, which was largely changed under Secretary Mattis, now focuses on peer competitors, and in particular on the issues of China's national strategy. And there's something called the National Strategy Document, which you all can read. It's actually really well written. And I enjoyed being a small part of the production of all of that work. When you think about 5G, let's start with what it means for you as a citizen in the United States. It's obvious because of the pandemic that we're going to be wired and wireless forever, and that people said, oh, I have enough bandwidth. You never do. And especially not for the kind of interactive learning and so forth, especially across a broad swath of our population. So done right, 5G has the opportunity of having much greater bandwidth and much more available for all of our citizens. I serve as the chairman of this New York State Commission, and I was not aware of how many disadvantaged people there are, even in the cities of America, who don't have what I consider to be basic access to the internet. And if your kid is doing Zoom school from home and they don't have a proper connection, they're going to lose a year of their education. That's a horrific thing. And unlike 4G, where the United States ended up in a leading position, 4G LTE and its various extensions, in 5G, China is the leader in domestic consumption. The reason the Pentagon cares about this is obviously the Pentagon is a large bureaucracy and a large institution, and it has an awful lot of communications components. So literally talking to each other and so forth and so on. But where it becomes really as important is in the areas of autonomy. And 5G allows for asynchronous and very tightly coupled communication using some new technologies, which again, your audience will understand in more detail. And the important point here is that you really can't build the kind of anticipated defense systems that allow for autonomy plus essentially peer-level communications and control without advances in 5G. At the moment, all of those advances are occurring primarily in China. Not good.
You know, about a year ago, the Defense Innovation Board came out with a report that basically said the U.S. is losing to China. And it went through all the reasons why, and some of the reasons, or some of the ways maybe that we could reverse that before it's too late. So from your vantage point, if you were to lay out the strategy to execute, to win the race to 5G, what would that look like? What would that be?
Well, let me give you some some general comments and then a specific thought experiment, which maybe you could explore with me. So the first observation is that we need to find a way to get bandwidth to the telecommunications folks. And in China, what they did is they took 200 megahertz of the mid-range spectrum between 3 and 6 megahertz, which is thought to be the most desirable. It goes through walls, it handles high bandwidth, and they gave it to the 3 telcos with a build-out requirement. And boy, are they building it out. They have anticipating 120 million 5G users by the end of this calendar year, a number which I find fantastic. How many 5G users on a daily basis are in our audience today? 1, 2? I don't mean 1,000, I mean 1 person, 2 people. How's your 5G phone doing? Have you measured the performance of your 5G service? And I'm not talking about 5GE, which is not real 5G. I'm talking about the real 5G. So we're clearly behind. So the first thing is we've got to get more bandwidth. And the most obvious place to get it is where China got it to, which is in this mid-range spectrum. However, there are key frequency technologies that the military uses. Think of them as AWACS and various forms of naval radar and so forth, which are occupying those spaces. It typically takes at least 10 years to clear that spectrum, that is to redesign the systems to move somewhere else. Frankly, these systems are so old, it might take longer than that. So the only technological solution that we could come up with is a sharing solution. So the DIB issued a report, which you can read, came out about a year ago, which goes through all of the dismal details that I just took you through and suggests a path of trying to figure out a way to share this spectrum. There's a lot of ways to share the spectrum, but the important point is that this is no longer a technological problem. There was a point where you could say, I can't share, but now we know how to listen using various forms of radios and see, oh, the military is not using it, I'll use it. And without stating the obvious, too obviously, naval radars don't operate in the center of our country. They just don't, right? Unless someone managed to borrow his ship and park it on somewhere in Chicago. So you see my point. There's plenty of space that if we could figure this out, the technology is there. So we recommended a relook around sharing. The DoD has announced that its core strategy is one about sharing. However, the combination of the White House, the FCC, the NTIA, which controls the military spectrum in the military, have not come to a complete agreement on how to do all the sharing. All I can tell you is that this is a business requirement for our country. It's a national security requirement. And the only idea I've been able to come up with to address the 5G shortfall against China is to share the military spectrum in some form, in some way.
There are two ideas that are now being discussed, focused intensely, and debated. One would have some of the DoD spectrum go through the FCC in an auction process. One idea would be to have the DoD keep it, issue an RFP to have a dedicated national security network with a dual use that would be commercial on a wholesale basis with the build out requirement that you referenced earlier. What are the advantages, disadvantages you see of those two approaches, and which do you think would be the best path to win actually the race as it relates to China?
Well, as you know, because I've told you very strongly, I favor the latter of the two. But let's go through these scenarios. For the last 20 to 25 years, we've had a very interesting model in America where the government figures out a reclaimed spectrum, which is a known limited resource, and they auction it to the highest bidder using a very complicated process which yields billions of dollars to our treasury. Sounds like a great thing. And as part of that, there are requirements as to building out and timing and so forth and so on. All of that makes perfect sense. What's the problem with that? It's not the most efficient use of the spectrum. Because frankly, we can share that spectrum if you didn't auction it. And the problem that, at least speaking as a critic, that I see is that everyone is organized around auctioning because they like the revenue without understanding that if you can create this sharing model, you'll create far, far more money in terms of not only sharing revenue, but actually gross revenue, because everyone will get more productive. It's the old thing of if you build more highways, you get more traffic. The highway costs you a fair amount, but what you really make up is in tax revenue from all the new stores and all the new activities and all the new people who move to the town, and it's the same principle. So the former, which is I think at the moment the government has announced a 100 megahertz auction, and I think that's their current plan. And that's an improvement because it would be used for 5G, but the problem is it's in the old way. There is a technology which is called CBRS, which was designed as a sharing technology. And there is something called the CBRS Alliance and so forth. And it appears to me that if you simply took some of the shared spectrum, if you will, and you implemented it using some of the CBRS principles, you could achieve all the prioritization and preemption things that you just described. But more importantly, you'd get much, much more bandwidth. Now, I should say there's another point, which we sort of haven't talked about, which is, and I was, I guess, a little bit responsible for this error, is that during the Obama administration, the Obama administration did not focus on this question of spectrum and 5G. And we spent a lot of time talking about sharing. And I was one of the original authors of sharing back in 2009, 2010. So the idea's been around for a long time. We promoted it, we endorsed it in all the ways that you could imagine. But it didn't occur to us that we would have to force the availability of the spectrum. The shortfall became clear after China's actions. And I think that was a fair error, critical for the past administration. But in any case, the other thing that we realized was that during this period of 15 years, the US domestic industry has largely left this space. So let's say you want to do a 5G build out and you don't want to use Huawei, and Huawei you don't want to use because you just don't want to use it, trust me. And at least at the infrastructure level. You can use Samsung equipment, you can use Nokia, you can use Ericsson. Where is that vaunted US supplier of semiconductor equipment that's at the state of the art? Doesn't exist today. And so another national objective we should have is to reclaim that space for innovation so that we are part of the stack of building extraordinarily capable 5G infrastructure. It's important for national security that that part of our chain be under US control, US laws, US security, that sort of thing.
You know, I want to go back. We kind of looked at the two choices, and you gave the advantages of why doing a DoD contract with a build out and using that on a shared spectrum basis. But you know, one of the big objectives who gets there first? What the speed of the deployment? Because whoever wins the first 5G network wins all of the applications of the future. And so the critical element of speed, which one would be faster? The current status quo model of auction, or doing it through the DoD through an RFP process?
Well, I'm sorry to be so unpleasant about this, but China's already won this race. So we're definitely playing catch up. It's a national emergency. So the solution is to act quickly, and the quickest way is to use the existing dynamic spectrum, use some form of wholesale model that would use private sector money to build out the network very quickly. The teams that I've spoken with have said that they can get it done within 2.5 years. And again, that's assuming a sharing model. The problem with the auction model is that you have to wait, and then the build out occurs, and it doesn't cover that much of the spectrum. And one of the interesting things about 5G is that the technology is impressive, the way they do encoding and so forth and so on. But the real reason 5G is faster is because there's a bigger block of bandwidth. And so having a nice big block of bandwidth, which is how you can get that through sharing, much bigger than 100 megahertz, also enables this thing. So unless we do some form of sharing, let me try to net it out, we will end up with a 5% solution, and China will have a 90% solution. Because it's not a big enough market, it's not fast enough, it doesn't enable new applications. And I care an awful lot about creating the next generation of software and Silicon Valley companies. And they will all be based on the outcome of this 5G infrastructure.
One last aspect, the capital allocation. Right now, capital goes in and flows into the auction and to the buying or leasing of the spectrum versus the actual deployment. Would this be a more efficient allocation of capital as well?
Depends on how it's done. If you ask a financial person on the telco side, they will say, this is a pretty good deal. What we do is we raise debt, we buy the auction, we buy the spectrum, and then we can hold it at its purchase price on our books. We don't have to depreciate it. It's more complicated than that, but it sounds like if you're an accounting person, and we have some in the audience, I'm sure, it's a pretty good deal, right? It doesn't depreciate, it just sits there on the books. So the system has a bias which tends to favor this auction model, even though it's spectrum less efficient. I would much rather have that capital that's now sitting on the books, right, in virtual land, essentially. I'd much rather have that spectrum, excuse me, that capital being used to build the towers. And by the way, a 5G network is not cheap. The towers have to have fiber to them because of the amount of bandwidth. Many of the towers need to be higher. There need to be more numerous towers. There are estimates that we need 1 million towers in the United States. These are non-trivial expenses. Obviously, you would use the existing towers, but you need more. You need to basically make sure that the radios that are being used are state-of-the-art. There's something called MIMO, which is how you get this extraordinary speed. We're talking about gigabit speeds to your device. I mean, can you imagine having fiber level speeds to the equivalent of your iPhone, iPad, Android phone, and so forth and so on? It would change our world. I'd rather have the capital go there.
And talk one last element of this. It's very difficult to build out. Well, I'll ask two questions in one. It's very difficult to build out to rural America and to underserved markets and to poor urban communities. Would this network help solve the connectivity issues across America, as well as doing it in a way where it's private capital? So will the money be there, and does it meet that unmet service need today?
So the rural America problem is really hard. And all of these communication systems depend on the equivalent of homes passed, right? The cost per homes passed. And I've been looking at this as part of my New York State work. And what I would tell you is that for 5G mobility, we can solve the 80% coverage problem in the suburbs and in the cities of our nation. And by cities, I mean reasonably smallish cities, you know, sort of, but not rural not rural towns, relatively economically efficiently. There's fiber to those places, there's tower sites, the tower coverage will work, and so forth. When you get to rural areas, you need a different solution. There are plenty of people who are looking at this. The best way to solve the rural problem, remember I mentioned the CBRS thing? There's a whole bunch of firms that are US based that are trying to figure out a way to use CBRS to provide last mile wireless. So instead of waiting for the coax or the fiber to come to your rural home, you would have a small dish that's fixed. So we probably can't provide gigabit 5G incredible service to your mobile phone, to a rural house. I think the economics probably don't work. Again, maybe there's some new inventions that will change that. But this rural line where the rural issue is a hard one. What we can do is use the same technologies on a fixed basis to get your home to have incredible internet performance for a fixed home, which obviously they don't move. And that's probably the best probably the best engineering compromise for this. Everyone wants to connect the whole world. One of the interesting histories here is that in the 30s and 40s, America did not have rural electrification. And so there was a legal mechanism which created essentially a rural co-op. And the rural co-ops were, the capital was raised locally and also from investors to provide last mile electricity. So we know that the electricity gets to the house. The question is, how can we get the connectivity to that house as well?
So as I listen, do you think with the DoD approach of a shared spectrum, a dual use commercial and national security, that it can help us the connectivity solution for all parts, even though it may be different in different parts of the country, rural to urban? But is it the best way to achieve both connectivity and win or catch up on the race to 5G as it relates to China? And then talk a little bit about the applications that the network enables, whether it's artificial intelligence, quantum computing, autonomous vehicles, and why that is so important in winning the race to this network.
The scenario you're describing is the best idea we've had so far. You know, maybe there's a better idea, but all of the other ideas have this core problem that the spectrum is not shareable. The spectrum is in the wrong place. It doesn't solve the problem within a 2-year period. You've got to solve a bunch of problems at the same time. So that's why I like this notion of sharing the military spectrum and doing it with their permission in such a way that they get incredible coverage, I mean, if I were designing this, I'd say, well, in return for sharing our spectrum, you better give us one heck of a quality 5G service for every one of our servicemen and our listed people. And what about our veterans? You know, I make a list like that if I were negotiating on the DoD side, which I'm not. But I think that there's a deal there that is an economically effective deal. And the reason is that ultimately people pay for communication services, and the likelihood of a strong set of 5G networks being successful financially is high because people really want that. The strategic issue has much more to do with how you think that 5G and the Internet of Things will evolve. Most people just say, oh yeah, everything's going to be on the internet, it's all going to work together and so forth. You can't pull that off without a flexible 5G network, and 5G was designed to do this. This is another example where the adoption of 5G will take a long time, but it should enable a large number of new companies that solve all sorts of things. And the Internet of Things, for people who are not familiar with the term, essentially means that all of the digital things that are in your world, whether it's the clock or the lamp or the oven or so forth, are all talking to each other in a way that you like. And it means that the system around you is much more aware of what's going on. It's much more dynamic. It's much more controllable. And done properly, it's also much more secure.
And I know that we're getting close on time, so one final question. Are you worried that just as we're entering this phase of critical competition with China, that we may also hamstring or cripple or harm the tech sector, which is really the leading economic driver of our economy? How does the current climate possibly harm our competitiveness as it relates to China?
Well, it's a funny thing that we take the leaders of the globe and we spend all our time tearing them apart inside the U.S. because we don't appreciate that they have global competitors. So let me say very clearly that I am really grateful to Amazon for existing and helping getting me through this pandemic, and I hope you are too. Right? Now, everyone wants to criticize these companies because of their scale and their role, and they certainly make mistakes, and I'm not making apologies for that. But the fact of the matter is that had we gone through the pandemic a la 1918, we'd all be pretty miserable, starting with the fact that this conversation couldn't occur. So let's start by being grateful that America, broadly speaking, invented these technologies under American rules and under American laws, and let's not regulate them to the point where they're no longer globally effective. I worry that the people who call for breaking up these companies don't understand that the competitors that are in other countries are not being broken up. They're being focused to target. And so I know that that's perhaps a surprise. Most people sort of say this, but let me tell you, the biggest issue right now in our country is the economic and social costs of the pandemic. And the best way to address that is to get more service to everyone that's inexpensively, which is sort of what the tech companies try to do because of their efficiency. Let's not forget that in our rush to regulate, in our rush to criticize. And again, the criticism is welcome, but remember, these are national treasures.
Well, Eric, this is a very timely conversation, and your recommendations, your insight, I hope people in Washington listen. We're grateful for what you've done to help lead the U.S. tech industry in its emerging days, and to give us the hindsight of the last 20 years. But I really hope that people listen to your advice for the next 20 years. And we're very grateful for what you're doing with Schmidt Futures and your philanthropic and your other missions. So thank you for joining us today.
No, and I should say, by the way, that, you know, for whatever reason, you decided to, you know, dive into this area, and it's had a big consequence. You have really led this. You're the one who got me involved with this current activity. And so I want to thank you for that. And if I can help you in any other way, let me know. And thank you all for your help in making America a more connected and great place.
Well, thank you, Eric, very much.